I began reading Nietzsche about 5 years ago. I didn't know too much about him, other than that he was regarded as an important thinker. I knew that his ideas were somehow related to religion, the Second World War, the conversation around truth, and that he was frequently quoted in Hollywood movies. So I wanted to know, who is this man that keeps being brought up? Then I proceeded to do what apparently so many others had done before. That is, I started reading the story of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The idea of a philosophical fiction is very attractive when you first want to get into philosophy, because at first glance it looks like an easier read than something more formal. But because it is a fiction, it contains a lot of references that are difficult to pick up on if you haven't read any of his other works. I could tell that there was much that went over my head. Still, I enjoyed the strange energy of his writing style, which motivated me to go back and read him properly, that is, starting at the beginning. As I moved towards his more famous books, what has been described as his mature philosophy, I decided I wanted to be even better prepared. That is why I picked up this book, Nietzsche and Philosophy, by Gilles Deleuze. In his own works, Nietzsche usually writes in short aphorisms that cover a wide range of topics. It is not obvious that they follow a red thread, or even that they are internally consistent. That is why I figured it would be a good idea to take part of a comprehensive introduction to his philosophy. I was also interested in Deleuze himself, as one of the so-called postmodern thinkers. And since Nietzsche is regarded as a pre-postmodern thinker, it makes it even more interesting to hear a reading of him from an actual postmodern or post-structuralist thinker. The first time I learned of postmodernism was in relation to the phenomenon around Jordan Peterson. I noticed that whenever he or someone else would critique postmodernism, they would always bring up two people as the source of these ideas, Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. At some point, I learned that Deleuze was yet another one of these famous postmodernists, but I've yet to hear any serious complaints against him. And so that made me curious. Why was his works excluded from these critiques? I also became interested in Deleuze because his later works deals with some topics that I find interesting. One of his books deals with a worldview that is purely immanent, that would lack any kind of transcendence. I personally have a very hard time with the concept of transcendence, understood as some exterior realm of permanence. But I do not yet know what the implications would be for a world that truly lacks transcendence. So this book was not only an introduction to Nietzsche, but also to Deleuze, as he introduces some of his own concepts here that would later become important for his own philosophy. So why did Deleuze write this book? Why was Deleuze interested in writing about Nietzsche? One of the main reasons was that French philosophy had at the time become dominated by the idea of Hegelian dialectics. Hegel was another German philosopher that was active before Nietzsche. I don't know very much about him, besides that he was famous for being difficult to read and this idea of dialectics. And my understanding of dialectics is that any movement or event creates an opposite reaction towards itself. This first event is referred to as a thesis, and the reaction to this thesis is called the antithesis. When the two parties come together, they form something additional, which is called the synthesis. The rest of Hegel's work remains unknown to me. But Deleuze mainly deals with the dialectic, so perhaps this is enough to know. Now with this book, Deleuze is going to argue that Nietzsche was the great anti-Hegelian, the great anti-dialectician, and so he is not merely trying to give a correct account of Nietzsche's thoughts, but he is actively using him as a tool to break the intellectual homogeny of his time. With a book like this, whose content comes from two deep thinkers, it is, of course, relevant to ask how much comes from Nietzsche and how much is added by Deleuze. Right now, I don't think I'm familiar enough with any of these thinkers to really answer that question seriously. There were several instances where I found the book to be unjustifiably unclear or contradictory, and I don't always know if I should critique Deleuze's writing or Nietzsche's thinking. My objections will be made against both of them, based on my subjective sense of where the idea is coming from. In the end, I don't worry too much about what is the correct reading. As long as one simply does not swallow everything without questioning, but carefully thinks through everything that one reads, then it could still help widening your thinking by introducing new useful or interesting tools to view the world. This way of reading, I believe, would at least be in agreement with Nietzsche's own views, as illustrated by one of his poems in The Gay Science. If I read me, then I read into me. I can't construe myself objectively, but he who climbs, consuming his own might, bears me with him unto the brighter light. As I mentioned previously, Nietzsche's own writings aren't very systematic. They cover a wide selection of topics, sometimes in several pages and sometimes in a single sentence. What makes them enjoyable to read nonetheless is partly that you can pick up one of his books and start reading whatever you want, at least in the case of Human All Too Human, Daybreak, and The Gay Science. There are reoccurring themes and concepts, and you can sense some kind of progression in his thoughts. But it is difficult to see with any clarity. Deleuze does a great job of presenting a kind of philosophical bedrock, the foundation of Nietzsche's thinking, and how the rest emerges from this foundation. It starts with Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy. In this stage, you could say that Nietzsche is still a mere philologist, and he would later write a new preface to his own work, criticizing it. This is also one of the few places I've found where Hegel is actually referenced in name. He comments that his own work smells offensively Hegelian. Apparently, he didn't mention Hegel much, despite him being such a dominant intellectual figure of his time. Deleuze thinks that this silence should not be used as an argument that it did not address Hegel, but that we should instead look purely at his philosophy and notice how it contrasts to the dialectic. Anyways, in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche praises the Greek culture, and especially the creation of the tragic drama. He even goes so far as to call it the highest form of art. Why is that? I think this is because tragedy deals with a central theme and question, not only to Nietzsche, but to everyone. The question of, is life justifiable? When we take into consideration all the arbitrary suffering and innate unfairness of existence, where we are thrown into a world without asking for it, with so many limitations and requirements, what should we make of this? In The Birth of Tragedy, this problem is called the original contradiction of life. And the solution is said to be contained in the unity of the principles of two gods, Apollo and Dionysus, to create the tragic art form. While I had mainly heard of these figures as the gods of the sun and of wine, here they represent something much more abstract. Apollo is the god of individuation. His answer to the contradiction of life is to take a moment of bliss, of beauty and joy, and to stretch it out into infinity. A single piece is taken out of the continuum and made eternal. An example of this art form would be a statue. Perhaps this is because the sun was viewed as eternal, unchanging, and singular. The second god is a bit more confusing, but also much more important for Nietzsche. He continually referred to Dionysus throughout the rest of his works, and even claimed to be the last philosopher of Dionysus. He is the suffering god, but only because he is the god of intoxicated unity, suffering included. This likely comes from the fact that alcohol has a double aspect to it. To say yes to a drink is to say yes to the potential of a very good time and a very bad time. If you are the god of wine, then you are not going to have just 2 glasses of red on a Friday night. He is the god of all the wildest consequences of alcohol. What he affirms isn't a depressing hangover. He affirms the entire spectrum of events that can follow in a single unity. His solution to the contradiction of life is precisely not to look at particular moments, or to list several of them to make a case, but that life should always be viewed as a totality, and to realize that this totality is not something static, but forever changing. This is where we get the tragic. The Dionysian principle is crystallized and captured in an artistic form via the powers of Apollo. What makes tragic art so powerful to Nietzsche is that it shows us that we are committed to life despite its terribleness. Because why do we go to experience tragic stories? It is not that we enjoy the horrible events of the play, but it is the play itself that we enjoy. Now, Nietzsche later claimed that even the Greeks didn't fully grasp the importance of the tragic, but that he was the first to realize it. Therefore, there is likely much more to it. But one thing seems pretty clear from this book, and that is that Nietzsche was concerned with our attitude towards life, and would come to attack the idea that life is erroneous and requires correction. Now I will try to go over some of Nietzsche's most famous concepts: the will to power and the eternal return. But to be honest, I still find both of these concepts very confusing, more so than I think they should be. So what is the will to power? One place to start is to compare it to Schopenhauer's concept of the will towards being. Nietzsche was a great admirer of Schopenhauer, at least in the beginning, but would gradually become more critical to his philosophy. It seems like Schopenhauer conceived of the world as having an intrinsic will, which was simply a will towards being. The world is because it wants to be. Nietzsche thought that this was a paradoxical idea, because that which wills already has being. Instead, where Schopenhauer found a will towards being, Nietzsche found something he called a will to power. If the will to power was something he conceived of independently from Schopenhauer, then it would seem more likely to belong to the human will. But if it was something to be contrasted to Schopenhauer's will towards being, then it could be viewed as an intrinsic aspect of the world itself. Deleuze never gives a definite answer, I think. Instead, he spends several passages explaining what the will to power is not. The will to power is not a desire for domination, authority, or money. He says that in some sense, it is the opposite. Because the will to power is something which creates new values. And if you wish to gain power in this more common sense of the word, then you would likely need to conform to established values. And Deleuze says at least one thing about the will to power, that it has two qualities, which are affirmation and negation. These are also regarded as two wills, whereas the second one is called the will towards nothingness. I get the hint that there is an additional aspect of the will to power that I'm much less sure of, that the will to power is also the origin for diversity in life, what Deleuze calls multiplicity. But before we can understand Deleuze, we must first deal with another concept, that is, the concept of force. Deleuze says that the will to power cannot be separated from force without falling into metaphysical abstractions. It is not clear to me that the term force is something that Nietzsche himself made use of. The only thing with some resemblance to this term is when he mentions drives. This would imply some sort of mental or psychological entity, an idea, or even a spirit. Similarly to what I've said about the will to power, the question of force versus drive is whether the first of them is a part of the world and second just of man, or if they indeed refer to the same thing. In the preface of the book, it is stated that phenomena, things, organisms, societies, consciousness, and spirits are signs, or rather symptoms, and themselves reflect a state of forces. Perhaps Nietzsche later explained more clearly what a force or a drive is, but with Deleuze I just had to go along with this vague description as something with a particular goal, or nature, which takes possession of phenomena. Now every phenomenon is always possessed by a multitude of forces, and the result of this interaction of forces is what we experience. Deleuze calls this the sense of the phenomenon. It is here that we first get what seems to be a postmodern idea in Deleuze, because every phenomenon can be possessed by different forces at different times, and has as many interpretations as there are forces capable of taking possession of it. The great phenomenon of the death of God is used as an example. God has not died once, but has had many deaths, and consequently has many interpretations and meanings. However, and this is an important point, Deleuze also says that the thing being possessed is not neutral. It cannot be possessed by every force, and each force has a different affinity for its object. What this means is that every phenomenon needs time to come in contact with the force with its highest affinity. This includes historical events. And that sense, which is created by the force with the highest affinity, is what gives the phenomenon its essence. But what does that mean? That the essence is the truth of the phenomenon? And what does it mean that an object can have a fixed affinity for a certain force? What even qualifies as an object in this context? Again, Deleuze does not comment much beyond this on the essence of things. All I can say is that it's a variation of what has been described as a sort of basics of postmodernism. That everything has multiple interpretations, but there are a limited number of interpretations for its phenomenon, and some are more superior to others in some sense. One example that is brought up is the influence of the Eastern priests on Greek philosophy. That the forces of the Greeks indeed came from elsewhere, but found their highest expression, their highest affinity with another object, namely with the Greeks. In Nietzsche's use of the word drive, he presents a more satisfying explanation. There are multiple texts which mention drives, taking it to be a psychological entity, something which emerges from the material and spiritual conditions of men. If a people are subjected to a type of teaching, a belief, or an environment over a sufficient period of time, then this will cultivate a psychological entity, a drive, which can propagate through people like an organism, living beyond its original conditions, into ages where those conditions have changed. This drive could also be viewed as a value, or a goal, or a will. As history progresses, drives from distant ages may come in contact with modern events, modern conditions. There it may be attracted to some phenomenon which fits into its own goal. You could imagine how religions and political movements are filled with drives that have different affinities. Then you might think that two drives can coexist or even cooperate. But what Nietzsche seemed to believe is that one would simply dominate the other. Going back to Deleuze, as forces take possession of a phenomenon, they come in contact with other forces. Perhaps an object isn't really an object, but only another collection of forces. A force is also a kind of movement towards a particular goal. And so when two forces come in contact, it immediately becomes a relation of domination and subjugation. One force rules, the other obeys. But what determines the outcome of this relationship? Deleuze says, a difference in quantity. But a quantity of what? The most tempting thing to say would be power, although then you would have to explain what power is. However, Deleuze never writes this outright. This initial difference in quantity also produces a difference in quality between forces. You can imagine the role of temperature on states of matter. At some point, a higher temperature converts a solid into a liquid. A quantitative difference between states gives rise to a qualitative difference. These differences in quality create two general types of forces, which are called active force and reactive force. This is where the will to power comes into play. Because the will to power is the principle which determines this relationship. It is said to be the differential and genetic element of force, that which makes them different and related to one another. I began to think of this as the nucleotides in different organisms. We all share the same building blocks, but they are arranged differently. This, however, presents us with a question, because throughout the book, Deleuze deals almost strictly with the case of one force relating to another. In this interaction, one is active and the other is reactive. But what happens when we introduce a third force? If this force has a higher quantity than either of the first two, will it become active and the others reactive? And following this line of reasoning to its limit, does that mean that any phenomena, any set of multitude of forces, only a single one of them is actually active? This interpretation does not go well with Deleuze's writing, as he never mentions the fact of a single dominating active force, but continually refers to these two classes of active and reactive forces, indicating a multitude of both of them being present. It seems that the aspect of active or reactive is an innate quality of forces. But what he describes in his explanation of the will to power is initially a relational quality that then becomes an innate quality. Generally, you would think that a quality is either innate or relational. The answer seems to be that this difference in quality is in reference to an internal threshold. Jumping ahead a bit, Deleuze writes that the dialectical force does not have enough strength to affirm its own difference. To get around the issue of a single dominating force, this strength, or lack of strength, must refer to its own internal struggle. And so that force, which does not contain enough strength for itself, becomes reactive. But then we would of course ask, what does strength mean here? Here we must be reminded that this is a postmodern philosopher. The answer will depend on the forces behind he who asked the question. But he limits these interpretations to just two characters, called the slave and the master. From the perspective of the slave, to be strong is conceived of as being recognized by others. From the perspective of the master, representing active forces, to be strong is conceived of as being capable of affirming one's own difference. This explanation is not very satisfying though, as it just answers the question by stating the conditions that created the question, becoming a cyclical kind of reasoning. Now, what is a reactive force? An active force has its own task to affirm, to pursue its own particular goal, its own difference, and affirmation is the first quality of the will to power. But when forces are no longer able to affirm, they switch to the second quality of the will to power, to negation. They now seek to negate, to nullify, to oppose. This is why the force is no longer active, but reactive. It is reactive in the sense that it reacts against something. It is no longer for itself, but against the other. The active force is also described as superior to the reactive force. Why is that? Because active forces are creative. They produce difference. Reactive forces merely nullify. An active force may still cause the nullification of something else, but in that case, it is merely a side effect of its difference. For the reactive force, the nullification is itself the goal. It is tempting to characterize these two qualities of the will to power as opposites, but from the standpoint of active force, they are merely different. Finally, here is where Deleuze tries to show how Nietzsche is the ultimate anti-dialectician. To analyze the world in terms of constant reactions is to only see it through reactive forces. Everything is a consequence of some action against something else, and you can no longer see how something can come into being for its own sake. In affirmation and active forces, there is room for the nuances of unique difference. In the dialectic, opposites react towards each other, and it tempts you to view them in extreme forms in order to push towards their synthesis. There is at least one more difficulty here that I see with the conception of forces and affirmation. Again, my understanding of force is a sort of not only human but worldly entity that has a particular difference, and that this difference lies in a specific goal or aim, and that this goal is fixed, and that would constitute the identity of the force. Now, in Nietzsche's own writing, and later on mentioned in Deleuze's book, affirmation is said to be not an affirmation of being, but of becoming. Indeed, as I will bring up again later, the character from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, who Deleuze describes as the characterization of species activity, is a man who is eternally searching for new things, new goals, to forever explore in all directions, which is not to say eternally seeking for knowledge. So at what level does becoming take place? If a force can change, if it can change its own difference, or if it is constantly changing, how does this happen? And then, does it even make sense to speak of individual forces? What seems more likely is that force does not change. In the hypothetical man of affirmation, firstly active forces are allowed to run their course, resulting in change. And secondly, new forces are allowed to enter or even leave man. But every force should have an affinity with its object. Do forces have different affinities for different people? And if they have a higher affinity, does that mean that they stay for longer? There are multiple comments and explanations of the will to power that makes this concept confusing. Just to give a further sense of this confusion, here follows a number of quotes from both Nietzsche and Deleuze on the will to power. Deleuze. The will to power is the element from which derive both the quantitative difference of related forces and the quality that develops into each force in this relation. Nietzsche. By the will to power, I express the characteristic that cannot be thought out of the mechanistic order without taking away this order itself. Deleuze. The will to power is being itself. Deleuze. That will that must be ascribed to force, both as a complement and as something internal to it. Deleuze. Force is what can. Will to power is what wills. Nietzsche. The fact is that the will to power rules even in the inorganic world. Action at a distance cannot be eliminated, for one thing attracts another, and a thing feels itself attracted. This is the fundamental fact. In order for the will to power to be able to manifest itself, it needs to perceive the things it sees and feel the approach of what is assimilated to it. Deleuze. The will to power manifests itself as the sensibility of force. The differential element of forces manifests itself as their differential sensibility. After presenting this theory of forces, Deleuze makes use of it to explain a history of man. He references a time before what is called history, and he calls that culture. Knowing Nietzsche, maybe the transition between these two eras could be set between the pre-Socratic and the post-Socratic Greeks. At least we can say that we modern men live in what is here considered history. The cultural and historical man possesses or is possessed by both active and reactive forces. He says that it was first in culture that man's active forces developed. It was only through culture that the mind could gain some firmness, that it could assume some stability in the world, and thus create the preconditions to make grand promises towards the future. However, Deleuze also describes culture as a type of violence, as the selection of men by men, which for the most part up until recently has been something brutal. In the era of culture, the goal was to produce men that could stand outside their culture and were capable of transforming it into something new. In history, society instead aims at their self-preservation and stability. In association with culture, Deleuze brings up something he calls the healthy man. Healthy means here that reactions are being acted out. In the unhealthy man, in contrast, reactions become something felt. Instead of actions, he is filled with inner reactions. There is something important here to keep in mind, namely that actions that a healthy man takes is still the expression of a reactive force. The active forces of man pursue their difference, their goal. The reactive forces respond, and this response falls out as an action in the world. But in the unhealthy man, the last effect of the active force is stopped. It is clogged, and this is what we would see in the historical man. The extent to which man is dominated by these reactive forces or drives can at first seem like a question of a majority and the exceptional individuals. Indeed, Nietzsche frequently does put people in categories of higher and lower in different ways. But he will ultimately critique the essence of not only a single group of people of his time, but the essence of man as he has existed during all times. Deleuze writes that the mental phenomenon that we call consciousness was something that Nietzsche regarded as the awareness of when active forces turn into reactive ones. And indeed, it can only perceive active forces after they have turned reactive. This puzzled me for many reasons. Why would the phenomenon of consciousness be essentially linked to reactive forces? And if that is the case, how could Nietzsche ever claim that there were active forces if these never appear in consciousness? It was after reading The Gay Science that I stumbled upon what I thought was an important text to help answer this question. In The Gay Science, Book 5, on the genius of the species, Nietzsche speculates around the origin and function of consciousness. He brings forth a question which I also feel is valid today, namely that, given how much we can do, but also how much other organisms seem capable of, without consciously bringing ourselves to that action, why do we need to be aware of this process in some cases, but not in others? Why do we not just robotically respond to our world, but must be aware of it all? Here Nietzsche speculates that consciousness has grown out of a need for communication, out of a need to receive and convey information. That is, as a collective tool, and more importantly, a characteristic of what he describes as the herd instinct in us. It is tricky to say exactly what we include in consciousness, but it seems that Nietzsche is describing these aspects of our thinking which is available to us in an articulated form, that are coded in language. Since language is used to communicate, it reduces the world to its common denominators. This would mean that language strips the world of so many things, including those things that we cannot articulate, but also the deeply personal aspect of all our experiences. It may also be said that consciousness is reactive because everything that enters consciousness is immediately questioned for reasons and explanations and justifications. The more instinctual ways of being, like laughter or fear or awe, take full possession of our being and are increasingly diminished as consciousness regains control. Nietzsche praises instinct over consciousness, saying that in productive men it is the instinct that is affirmative. Instinct was something creative, and consciousness something that would critique it. But he says that in Socrates this was reversed. The tendency to question became instinctual. Going back to the cultural man, even he was under the sway of this reactive consciousness. But when he would no longer act out his reactions, the outlet for the active force was clogged. The question is what happened to the active force. Deleuze writes that it is then internalized, turned against ourselves, and becomes a source of pain. And the once active man has turned into a man of resentment, as he is increasingly unable to discharge his active forces upon the world. The world in turn increasingly becomes a constant source of pain. This pain, interpreted by reactive forces, becomes a fault of something that is to blame. This source of pain has been guided by particular religions, where the priest has made use of fiction to redirect the source of what is to blame. He says that in Judaism, this was directed to the external world, something outside of us. Nietzsche even writes that in Judaism, wrath is considered something holy. Then came Christianity. It introduced a new fiction, which tells us that the source of our pain is to be found within us, that we are to blame. This he calls the bad conscience, and it is something more destructive than can seem at first glance. Since one would seek something blameworthy, or punishable for the pain caused by the internalization of active force, to pose oneself as the one deserving of punishments for one's own pain, it becomes a vicious cycle. This is how the priest creates a condition from which we must be saved. This salvation comes in the form of the ascetic ideal, the conception of another world, a world of higher value, and consequently, the diminishing value of this world. This sets up a new framework, which makes this increasingly miserable life tolerable, justifying the continued denial of active forces, of self-denial. From this description, it is very tempting and easy to view these reactive forces as something entirely negative in Nietzsche's eyes. But Deleuze claims that this is not the case, that there are nuances to this discussion. The introduction of a limitation to oneself can actually introduce new powers in us, that is, new perspectives and ways of thinking. He also writes that science actually deals exclusively with reactive forces. Again, this is likely because it is a characteristic of reactive forces to demand explanations, rather than to blissfully go along with the phenomenon. Deleuze also asked the question, when reactive forces manage to make active forces reactive, are they not themselves being active, pursuing their own goal of nullification? But unfortunately, I don't think he ever gives a clear answer to this question. So, Nietzsche was not necessarily seeking to completely get rid of reactive forces. Probably, he thought that this was something impossible. What he did strive for, Deleuze writes, was a way of turning reactive forces into active. At this point, it almost sounds like there were numerous active forces at a time, but that these have since continued to shrink in number. But Nietzsche seemed to have believed that the world was eternal, and so there would already have been an eternity for this process to take place. And yet Deleuze never mentions anything about the creation of new active forces. Anyway, what Nietzsche sought for was a way of becoming active. In the background of this psychological theory, this becomes a much more radical goal, as this means the introduction of a new mental faculty, fundamentally different from consciousness, something like the awareness of active forces or the become active of reactive forces. For that, we would require a new sensibility, a new way of feeling. Among the famous philosophical concepts that Nietzsche brought forth, the eternal return has long been the least interesting to me personally. Perhaps that is because he does not touch upon this idea until his later works, but also because I thought I understood what it meant. I thought it meant simply this, that one ought to live one's life in such a way that one would like to redo it again and again for eternity. It sounded like a more sophisticated version of live life to its fullest, an impossible ideal, which was too vague to actually implement, only capable of acting as a kind of guiding principle. When Deleuze writes about the eternal return, it is introduced as a concept related to being, becoming, and affirmation. He brings up the pre-Socratic thinker Heraclitus, who most famously said that you cannot step into the same river twice. From this statement, we might interpret it as there is only change, no eternal identity or essence, no being, only becoming. However, he also introduced the idea of becoming as being, of change as identity. This is what Deleuze claims to be the meaning of the word return. He writes, "Return is the being of that which becomes. Return in the being of becoming itself, the being which is affirmed in becoming. This means that the return is not a return to an identical state, but a return to the affirmation of difference and multiplicity. But this is not the end of it. Later in the book, he brings up how Nietzsche thought it was necessary to introduce a second affirmation. The first affirmation is the being of becoming. But the second affirmation is of the first process of affirmation. Deleuze writes, affirmation as object of affirmation. This is being. This second affirmation is represented symbolically by Ariadne, the princess of Creta, who gave Theseus a sword and ball of thread to deal with the Minotaur, and who would become the wife of Dionysus. The eternal return is thought of as a ring, as their wedding ring. With this explanation in mind, Deleuze makes use of the eternal return to motivate the superiority, nobility, and higher worth of active forces. He writes, "What is better, and better absolutely, is that which returns, which can bear returning, that which wills its return." Now we go back to Nietzsche's task of the become active in man. We cannot yet feel or even know this become active, but Deleuze claims that it can be thought of as a product of a selective principle. The eternal return is this selective principle. After this explanation, I still have tremendous trouble placing it in a practical context outside of the philosophical system that Deleuze has presented. Still, he makes the claim that this obscure teaching is made unobscure by practical clarity. This clarity, the practical teaching of Nietzsche, is that difference is happy, that multiplicity, becoming, and chance are adequate objects of joy by themselves, and that only joy returns. I would still seriously question the supposed practical clarity that he mentions. But here he reveals a key point, one without which Nietzsche's whole philosophy would probably lose all of its attraction. He links happiness to a mode of being, a happiness that is not simply a sensual pleasure, but something deeper, subtler, and sturdier, like a joyful soul, often described as being light. This is enough to construct a somewhat concrete rule for how you should live your life. In order to achieve this noble lightheartedness, one should look to make oneself an object of affirmation. One should start regarding oneself not as a being in the static sense, but as a becoming, as a process, and that whatever this I am is something good, something that is worthy of pursuing and expressing. Today we may sometimes hear that we should learn to accept ourselves. In that acceptance there is usually an admission of our imperfections and shortcomings. This may be thought of as saying okay to ourselves. But Nietzsche seemed to advocate that we learn to actively say yes to ourselves, again and again, without any shame. But this yes is still not a complete yes towards everything that we can identify within ourselves. The eternal return is a selective principle. We are still possessed by drives or forces of the reactive type that are the result of suppression or negation. Since only affirmation has being, those entities should not be considered truly part of our being. In order to know what we are, we must then investigate what we are suppressing in ourselves. With this, we are pursuing both happiness and activity. Quote, "There is no unhappy consciousness, which is also man's enslavement, a trap for the will, and an opportunity for all baseness of thought." Deleuze. Next I will go over how Deleuze thinks that Nietzsche's ideas are represented by the characters in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Some of them will represent Nietzsche's idea of nihilism. There are multiple forms of nihilism, but all are linked to the will to power as its quality of negation. It is also linked to what is called the will to nothingness. I would say that the will to nothingness was simply another name for this negative quality of the will to power. However, Deleuze describes it as something that can exist in cooperation with reactive forces, but not as something integral to them, that it can break from them. But, as I have already said, Deleuze also writes that the will to power, which then would include this will to nothingness, cannot be thought of outside of forces. Then I guess that whenever this cooperation is broken, then reactive forces would have to be animated by the will to power's affirmative aspect. Even though there is a common association between affirmation and action, between reaction and negation, they are not essentially linked. The first form of nihilism is reactive nihilism, represented by the ugliest man. This attitude is what is immediately followed after the death of God. The reactive man had previously only recognized values which were placed above of or superior to life, in God and a heavenly kingdom. When God dies, the reactive man feels that all value in this world has suddenly vanished. Reactive nihilism becomes a denial of all values. The ugliest man presents Zarathustra with a theory on the cause of God's death. He explains that it was in fact him, the ugliest of all men, who is in fact the murderer of God. He says that God had to die because of his pity for man. Pity is here interpreted as the love of life close to nothingness, that is weak, poor, sick, powerless and suffering. As man came to regard himself with more and more shame, he had a breaking point where he could no longer endure God's love, to be so nakedly revealed for the wretched creature that he was. He says that such a witness had to die. The second form of nihilism is called passive nihilism, and it's represented by the last man. In passive nihilism, reactive forces have become separated from the will to nothingness, which they had been animated by through the death of God. He has given up on having a will, neither towards commanding nor obeying. He simply wishes to blend in with the herd. He wishes for nothingness, but not in an active sense, as with the will towards nothingness, but to keep the reactive life going until it would fade away passively. This is why passive nihilism is represented by the last man. He continues the reactive life without any will whatsoever. This can be regarded as a characterization and critique of the modern man, who only wishes for security, comfort, and health, who does not wish to be commanded nor to command. And Nietzsche thought that all willing was an act of either commanding or obeying. The concept of the bad conscience is represented by the character called the sorcerer. He presents Zarathustra with a tragic view of the world, but that is exaggerated and deceptive. What he wishes for is to excite pity, to spread his melancholy to other people. Instead, Zarathustra stops him in his speech and hits him over the head with a stick. The two kings are supposed to represent customs and culture, understood in this way as a time before what is called history. One of them stands for the principles in prehistoric times, and the other its suppression in historic times. The man with leeches, or as Nietzsche called him, the spiritually conscientious one, is the representative of the scientific man. He is a strange man who has learned to endure pain and hard work for his goal, to attain a narrow, highly specialized, but most importantly truthful piece of knowledge. In this example, he has decided to study the brain of the leech. He believes it is better to know a single thing with great certainty than to half know many things. But in order to achieve this goal, he must essentially learn to think like the leech, to almost become it. He sacrifices his own subject to attain the objective, and is more and more transformed into a tiny mirror. Maybe that is why he lies so closely to the surface of the waters of the swamp that Zarathustra almost tramples him. The last pope is a man who had been deeply committed to the servitude of his god, but who now despairs because he can no longer find his master, and yet he cannot feel free. He only has one eye, and Deleuze believes that his other eye was once capable of seeing also the affirmative gods, because they do exist. Religion is not essentially reactive, but has become one of many reactive byproducts of history. Next, the voluntary beggar, whom I have a hard time placing in the context which Deleuze has provided. He is a man who seeks the kingdom of heaven, and more specifically, who the kingdom of heaven belongs to. He wishes for man to be rid of his great affliction, that is, his disgust. At one time he possessed great riches, but chose to cast them aside out of the shame for the rich. Then he joined the poor, believing they were the truly good people, but they would not welcome him. He found that they were full of revenge, envy, and populace pride. Populace above, populace below. What are poor and rich at present? That distinction did I unlearn. Then did I flee away further and ever further, until I came to those kine. What he admires in the cows is apparently their ruminating. And Deleuze writes that rumination is the product of culture as culture. There are a couple of animals in the story of Zarathustra, and he frequently refers to his animals in the way you would speak of your dearest friends. In his travels, he encounters not one, but two fire dogs. They both symbolically represent the species activity, but one of them is a hypocrite. He claims to be speaking out of the belly of things, meaning something like I am the absolute source of knowledge. But this first dog is only representing modern institutions, like churches and states. There is, however, a second fire dog, which does indeed represent the species activity of man in prehistorical times. Then, joining the higher men in Zarathustra's cave, there is a donkey. He tries to be the affirmative animal, and has understood this as an unconditional yes towards everything. He can only say yea, but his affirmation is a false affirmation. He has only learned to take on heavy burdens, to accept responsibility, and to regard that which is hard and heavy to bear as real. But what Zarathustra calls for is also a holy no and a lightness of heart. The last of the higher men who Zarathustra encounters is a character which has already been mentioned in Nietzsche's other works. In fact, the second half of Human All Too Human was named The Wanderer and His Shadow. In thus spoke Zarathustra, it is only the shadow that is speaking. He has lost his wanderer. He is this species activity itself, in despair. He wants to affirm, but has lost his goal. He wants to explore the world without any provision, all that is forbidden, the most dangerous wishes, and the remotest worlds. Now he has lost his belief in goals altogether. He is the character that Zarathustra seems to have the most sympathy for. He warns the shadow of a great danger that now presents itself, namely to be seduced by narrow dogmatic faith. There is room for one more character in the story of Zarathustra, but who never appears, except maybe as one of the earlier characters in the book, the rope dancer. The man who Zarathustra praises and calls for, the man who wishes for his own destruction. Perhaps he does not appear because that would contradict what he is. In The Last Man, the will to nothingness is said to have been separated from the reactive forces. In The Man Who Wants to Perish, that will is very much present, but it now serves under active forces. It now participates in the dramatic destruction of all that is reactive in man. This falls out as a man who joyfully wishes for himself to be overcome, who wishes for the overman. This would then constitute what Deleuze calls completed nihilism. The idea of the overman falls out as the final point of Nietzsche's philosophy, and I believe that to understand him is to understand what the overman is, and imagine what kind of radical transformation that would have to take place to achieve him. A lot points towards that we are unable to understand him by our very nature. What is interesting to me, though, is how this longing for the overman resembles the very world denial that Nietzsche opposes. Before, we had priests to tell us that this world is of no value other than a path towards heaven or hell. Now we have the prophet Zarathustra, who tells us that man needs to be overcome, that he is nothing but a rope over an abyss towards the overman. Of course, this may be a misunderstanding of Nietzsche, but the resemblance in thought seems so obvious that it should deserve a comment from Deleuze. Yet it is never brought up. He never deals with the question whether Nietzsche, in his radical affirmation of life, also abandoned man, and what he would make of that. In the end, Deleuze manages to present a blueprint to map Nietzsche's ideas onto, even though much of the language used in it remains very obscure. And I can't help but to become suspicious when it commits towards descriptions such as the will to nothingness breaks its alliance with reactive forces, treating these ideas as living entities. I've chosen to leave out certain parts of the book that I didn't find very informative or interesting, such as his comparison between Nietzsche's project and Kant's project of a philosophical critique, but I believe I've included the main points. I will end this with a text from Beyond Good and Evil that seemed to capture some of what this book is trying to describe as Nietzsche's journey and the aim of his philosophy. He who has prompted the same enigmatic desire has, like me, long endeavored to think pessimism through to the bottom, and to redeem it from the half-Christian, half-German simplicity and narrowness with which it finally presented itself to this century, namely in the form of the Schopenhauerian philosophy. He who has really gazed with an Asiatic and more than Asiatic eye into the most world-denying of all possible modes of thought, beyond good and evil, and no longer, like the Buddha and Schopenhauer, under the spell and illusion of morality. Perhaps by that very act, and without really intending to, may have had his eyes opened to the opposite ideal, to the ideal of the most exuberant, most living and most world-affirming man, who has not only learned to get on and treat with all that was and is, but who wants to have it again and again as it was and is to all eternity, insatiably calling out the capo, not only to himself but to the whole piece and play, and not only to a play, but fundamentally to him who needs precisely this play, and who makes it necessary, because he needs himself again and again, and makes himself necessary. What? And would this not be Circulus Vitiosus Deus?